Hi, and welcome to Things in My Head. I'm Angel Birch, your host. Hey, happy Mother's Day. This is our Mother's Day show. We're going to approach Mother's Day a little bit different this time. I have got psychologist Julia Becker on the line with us today, and we're going to be talking about Mother's Day after the loss of a child. It's said that when a child precedes a parent in death, it's one of the hardest types of grief to get over. It also is one of the longest lasting. And we would like to talk about that today. If you're going through this or you know somebody who is going through this, we invite you to listen to our show today and Dr. Julia Becker right after this.
Hi, Mom. It's Lexi. I hear you crying sometimes when you're alone. I wanted to tell you it's okay. And sometimes I know you think you hear me calling you when I'm not. That's okay too. Mom, I know how much you love me still, even though I'm not with you. But you didn't cause my death. The drunk driver who hit us did. Please stop blaming yourself. You didn't do anything wrong. Please talk to someone. It can help. And Mom, I'm not hurting. And I don't want you to keep hurting either. I love you too, still.
Talk to someone. www.findapsychologist.org. Welcome back to Things in My Head, and thank you so much for joining us on today's show. Like I said before the commercial break, we are going to be talking about Mother's Day, but not your typical show. We're going to be talking about when the loss of a child happens and you're a mother and you have to go through Mother's Day without that child. So we have invited Dr. Julia Becker to be with us today on our show. She is a licensed psychologist. Dr. Becker, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate this because I know people who have had to go through this. Normally, when a parent loses a child, that's just such an intense grief. You know, it's just like no other grief. They say that it's the hardest grief to get over. Is that true?
I believe so. I've seen patients in my practice who have lost children either as babies or teenagers or adults, and it is something that they never truly get over. It continues to be a source of great sadness in their lives.
Why is that? Is it that we just feel like we've lost so much a part of us?
I believe that's part of it, that the children, nobody expects their child to die before them. And there's such a special bond between parent and child. And often there comes with it this feeling of guilt that the parent didn't do enough to prevent the child's death. There's often this survivor's guilt. The parent may feel that they should have died instead, or like I said, they just didn't do enough, whether it was an accidental death or an illness. There's thoughts of what could they have done differently. And the guilt can be just as difficult as the sadness over the loss.
Now, I mentioned, Dr. Becker, that you are an actual licensed psychologist. Now, what is the difference between, say, going to see someone like you as opposed to just seeking out a grief counselor or a grief therapist?
Well, the term counselor is a pretty general term, and that is applied to people who have either a doctorate degree or it could be a master's degree. So there's all different kinds of counselors, but a psychologist is a counselor who has the highest level of training. Psychologists have doctoral degrees, and that's the greatest amount of experience out of other counselors.
Okay. So what would be the benefit of someone coming to see someone who is a licensed psychologist as opposed to just seeing someone who's maybe a therapist who doesn't have that doctoral degree?
Well, when you see any therapist, it's really important to look at their training and their experience and to make sure that they have the experience working with grief and that they've been trained in the techniques and that they understand how to help someone with that particular problem. And there are many grief counselors who are very good, who are not psychologists. So it's just important to check the credentials and the experience of the person that you plan on seeing for therapy.
Okay. What type of person would come and see you? Who would come and see you?
I see all different sorts of people. I see many young adults who are struggling with life transitions, issues, who may have mild to moderate or even severe depression or anxiety. And I see people dealing with grief who have suddenly lost a loved one. I see people dealing with eating disorders or family of origin stress, and just typical life stress, changing jobs, um, school starting, school ending. Those types of things can be very challenging for people. Relationships and
Basically, anyone who feels overwhelmed by any kind of stressor in their life, something that maybe they can't overcome by themselves, and they feel the need to sit down and talk to someone like you.
exactly. Yes, people are realizing the value of working through emotions and seeking help from somebody instead of just turning to medication to try to help them feel better. People want to work through their feelings and develop those coping skills, and that's what I help people to do.
I think that's a stigma that gets attached a lot to psychologists. They, used to be called shrinks, and the stigma attached is that they're always, when you go see them, the first thing they're going to do is write a prescription for you, that they're going to put you on drugs.
Yes.
And that's always the answer, right?
Right. Yes. And that's what people misunderstand, especially because the word psychiatrist is so similar, and psychiatrists are the ones who actually prescribe the medicine, while psychologists are trained in therapy.
Awesome. So maybe if you don't want to go on any kind of medication, but you do want to work through your issues, then seek out psychologists, not a psychiatrist.
Right.
Okay. So
yes, it's a common misunderstanding.
So getting back to Mother's Day, it's coming up, and flowers and chocolates and little kids bringing their mommies gifts that they bought with their own money, or even a picture of mommy and me. We all remember as a parent those little gifts and trinkets that we got, our children growing up giving us on Mother's Day to make us feel really special on that day. How does someone even begin to deal with a day like that when they have lost a child, either through death or through circumstances? Maybe, this child no longer has contact with them anymore. How do you just even start a day like that? I couldn't even imagine.
Right. Well, recognizing that the first Mother's Day after the death of a child is going to be probably the most difficult, and every Mother's Day that precedes it is going to be difficult as well. But it's important for the mothers to give themselves the permission to feel sad. And even if it's been 10 years and their friends and family are saying, why is it still affecting you? It's been 10 years. You should be over it now. The truth is that they never truly get over it. It's just a matter of coping a little better, make it a little easier as time goes on. So to give themselves that permission to feel sad can be very freeing. And that can help a lot with the anxiety that comes along with Mother's Day. And I tell my mothers who have lost children to allow themselves time during that day to grieve. It doesn't have to be the whole day, but setting aside a period of time that they can grieve in their own way, whether that's going to visit the cemetery or having some kind of symbolic ritual that they participate in that honors the child, that helps them remember that child, and allowing a period of time to cry or feel sad and just be okay with that.
We do that a lot. We, when we're going through a day of, like Mother's Day, when we remember our children, we tend to go back to a special moment. And, it's interesting that you would say, give yourself permission to experience that moment again, or to just really grieve about not having that moment ever again.
Right.
Why is it so important? I mean, why do we not give each other permission? Why do we not give ourselves permission to grieve? I mean, that seems like it would be just such a natural thing to do when you're talking about it, but then when you're going through it, why is that so hard to do?
Well, I think part of it is that we live in a society where it's expected that people be happy or pretend to be happy, that others see that happy face, and nobody wants to bring others down. And there's a perception that by being sad and grieving, that's going to bring others down and that others won't be accepting of that sadness. And there's a real pressure to be happy. And if you go and look in the self-help section of any bookstore, you'll see a lot of books about finding happiness and overcoming depression.
Right. Finding your moment to be that happy person.
Yes. And those expectations can create a lot of anxiety and lead to even more sadness and a lot of suffering and silence.
And you think about a mother and the relationship with her child, it's a very intense one.
It is. From the beginning, it is such a strong bond, such a feeling of love. And it's just heartbreaking to lose that.
I got to ask this. What is it like as a psychologist to hear that grief, that just heart-wrenching grief from a mother that has lost their child?
It's very sad. It can really weigh on me. And I have several therapist friends that have talked about how this affects them as well. And working with people who are experiencing that grief, especially in the early stages where it's so raw, that can be very difficult for the therapist. And it is such a privilege to help people through that, but it can be difficult. And that's why it's so important for therapists to practice self-care and make sure they're taking care of their own emotions and staying healthy in that way.
Well, I suppose if you go and talk to a friend, most of your friends are therapists, so you're getting, really good advice there.
Yes, having therapist friends is very useful.
Well, okay, you talked about raw emotions when the loss happens and it's recent. I don't even know how to think about that, having such a raw, intense emotion. But I have experienced it through friends and family who have lost children. And when the loss is so new, the emotions that they go through, it's almost a fast forward of a bunch of emotions all at once.
Right. Yes, there can be sadness, anger, denial, all of these things happen at the same time. And it's hard to tell which emotion is the most intense, and it can change from moment to moment. And at that point in time, it's really about survival, not trying to get rid of these emotions, but just trying to ride through it like a storm, just getting through that time when the emotions are so raw and intense. At that point, therapists are often working with the person to help them take care of their basic needs, remembering to eat and sleep and take care of younger children if there are younger children in the household. But just getting through the day is the priority at that point, and then later more of the healing can come.
How long does someone usually grieve for the loss of a child?
Well, I'd say the first year is really the hardest. That's when the emotions are the most raw, and the person who lost the child is experiencing everything for the first time, the first Christmas without the child, the first birthday. And so it's very intense that first year. And over time, they learn ways to cope with those significant events and get more into a routine, and the emotions become less intense, but they never fully feel like they're done grieving. And I've worked with mothers who have lost children 20 years ago, and they're still grieving in a way, but it's a different type of grief than what they experienced at the beginning.
Wow. 20 years. That just seems like an excessively long time. And this is from someone, coming in from the outside, looking in, and you're watching someone go through this. And I think the tendency for people looking on tends to be, after a few months or after, even the first year, and they tend to say, well, why are you not over this yet? Why does it still hurt the way that it does?
Right. And it's important to note that even though they're still grieving for 20 years or so, it's not that they are miserable. They can still be happy and have a full life and have joy, but never fully get rid of that pain of losing a child.
Right. Something has changed. Something's changed my life.
Right.
How does this type of grief, especially for mothers, how does this type of grief differ from other types of grief? Because it's been said that losing a child is the most intense, is the most painful, is the hardest to get over. Is that true? And if it is, then why is that true? You know, I mean, it seems to me that if you lose a spouse, wouldn't that be the same?
Well, losing a spouse is also very difficult, but many people are able to move on in a way, maybe remarrying or finding some other path in their life, focusing on their volunteer work or their job or their children.
They can't do that when they lose a child?
Not in the same way. That child is always missing. There's always that thought of, what would this child be like as the years go on? What would this child be like as an adult? Would there be grandchildren in the future? It's an unrealized future that they think about and wonder about. And it's something they never thought they would ever have to experience.
So it's kind of the grief that keeps on giving, basically.
It is. Yeah.
Wow. I mentioned a little bit before about mothers who maybe are going through Mother's Day without their child because that child refuses to talk to them, refuses to, have anything to do with them, or maybe they live too far away and it's just impossible, or maybe they're in a situation, maybe they're deployed or something like that, where they're in a situation where they're not able to have contact with that child for long periods of time. How does a mother cope with that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and those are all different scenarios. The one where the child is estranged from the mother, that can be very hurtful because the mother may have friends whose children are involved, and then there's this question of, well, where's your son or daughter? What happened? And that pain can be still very raw, and it's difficult for mothers to talk about that with their friends. They may feel ashamed and not want to admit that they have that estrangement. And there can be all kinds of conflicting feelings. But at the same time, there can be hope that things will get resolved and this relationship can be repaired in time.
So is that what you would tell someone as far as, some advice? I know that you're not giving us a session, but, just briefly, would that be something that you would tell someone? You need to hang on to the hope instead of the fear of the unknown?
It depends on what's happened, the history of their relationship, and if it seems that there can be some mending in the future, I would help them to focus on that and to accept that at this time things are rocky between them, but perhaps given their past relationship, that might be a good indicator that there is hope for the future, that they can move through whatever rough patch has caused them to become estranged.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about deployment? We live in an area here in Texas where we have a lot of young men and women who are being deployed into unknown circumstances. A lot of mothers being left at home with really facing the unknown as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that is a situation too where I would advocate focusing on that hope and trying to celebrate Mother's Day, even though there is that fear, there's the unknown, and their son or daughter is not able to physically be with them, but rejoicing in that their son or daughter is alive, is involved in their life, serving their country, and focusing on the positives that they have.
Awesome. We've got to take a commercial break, but when we come back, I'm going to ask Dr. Becker if she could give us just a few little tips. If you are going through something like this, you're a mother who has lost a child and Mother's Day is coming up. We're going to ask Dr. Becker to maybe give us a few little tips to get through that day, as well as talk about what you can do as a friend or a family member to help someone get through something like this. We'll be back.
Bridgeport Lake Bed and Breakfast outside Dallas, Texas can give you the perfect intermission of warmth and lake activities. From the long stem chocolate rose on your pillow at check-in to the made-to-order breakfast each morning, you'll leave your stress behind and immerse yourself in unparalleled Texas hospitality. Bridgeport Lake Bed and Breakfast. For reservations, call 940-644-0081 or visit us on the internet at www.bridgeportlakebnb.com.
Thanks for joining us again with Dr. Julia Becker, who is a licensed psychologist. We're talking today about Mother's Day, but in a different way. We're talking about mothers who have lost a child either through death or through being estranged or being away from them. How do you get through that as a mom? So that's why we're talking with Dr. Becker today. And she's given us some really great insights into what happens with someone who's grieving and someone who's lost a child. Dr. Becker, if someone is going through something like this right now, what would you say to them? How would you tell them to expect getting through Mother's Day, and how would they do that?
Well, if this is their first Mother's Day without the child, I'd say expect that this Mother's Day could be very difficult and overwhelming, and they're going to need some support. So they need to have some things set into place to help them get through the day, whether that's family members, a spouse, or friends. They need support during that day. And for mothers who have been through Mother's Days before without their child, they know a little bit more about what to expect. They may have a similar reaction each year. So pay attention to what that reaction is and plan accordingly. If they know that certain things set them off and make them feel even more sad, then try to avoid those things. So, for example, if going out to a restaurant and seeing all of the mothers with their children having their Mother's Day lunch, if that is a especially difficult thing, maybe they could have some other activity that day.
I think for me, it would probably be, my tendency is to isolate myself. So you're saying don't do that. If that's your tendency to do that, then do the opposite.
Right. If isolating yourself causes more pain, then find some way to involve yourself with friends and family, not necessarily the whole day, but for part of the day. So to give yourself permission to feel sad and let yourself be alone if you need that time for part of the day. But know that everybody has the limits. And so spending time alone all day may cause you to feel worse than if you were to spend some time with friends and family for part of the day.
So it sounds like you need to give yourself permission to grieve, but also give yourself permission to be happy too.
Yes, finding that balance is important, and there will be plenty of time for grieving over the years, but there can be joy over the years too. So it's important to allow those different feelings to be present.
What about someone who is on the outside looking in? You're the friend or a family member.
Right.
You know, I think a lot of times we don't know what to say. I know when, for example, I had a family member who I had just gotten in touch with from many, many years of not having contact with them. And we found each other again on social media. And within a week, I was actually talking to her that day, and she just had that mother's intuition that she needed to call her son at work. He was older, and she kept saying, no, I think I need to get off here and go call my son. And I said, okay, well, we'll meet up later. And I didn't hear from her. And later on, she popped back onto social media to let me know that she did call, and they were just about to call her, telling her that he had been in an accident and had died. And I mean, it was just the hardest thing for me to know what to say to her. On one hand, my heart just ached for her. But on the other hand, it was like, I'm scared to say anything because I don't want to make it worse.
Right. And that's a common fear that people have. They kind of tiptoe around the person who has lost somebody, and they fear saying the wrong thing. But most of the time, what you say in comfort isn't the wrong thing. saying, I'm so sorry, I'm here for you. Those are great things to say. And letting the person know that you truly want to help in any way that they need. It's important too to be more specific. Instead of saying, let me know if you need anything, offer something specific like, let me know if I can bring a meal or come over and watch your children or take you out someplace. Because people who are grieving are often unlikely to ask others. They don't want to burden their friends. Even though a friend has said, let me know if you need anything, there's this idea
Right.
that maybe they didn't really mean it, or
Well, I mean, we don't really do that anyway. You know, when somebody says, oh, well, call me for lunch, you don't really call them. I think the tendency is not to.
Yes. So really, a friend can take that extra step to try to involve their grieving friend and reach out to them, because it's often the case that the person grieving is going to isolate themselves. They're not going to be reaching out to friends and family.
Let's say it's the husband who is trying to comfort his wife through this Mother's Day,
Right.
you know, after the loss of a child. He's hurting, she's hurting, but what do you do?
Yeah, that's the tough thing, because the fathers have their own pain, but they sometimes feel like they have to be the strong one for the mothers, and that they have to bury their pain. And that can cause a lot of trouble for them. But comforting the mother on Mother's Day may be just what the mother needs, because Mother's Day is going to be more difficult for the mothers, and then Father's Day will be difficult for the fathers. So each spouse can comfort the other on the days that are more difficult for them. And communication is very important. After the death of a child, it often takes a toll on a marriage, because each person
Right, you
is...
hear of a lot of marriages breaking up after the death of a child.
Right, each person grieves in their own way, and communication sometimes lapses, and it can just draw people apart.
So how do you prevent something like that? Just keep talking?
Yeah, just keep talking. I often advise people to get their partner in counseling. Sometimes one person will go to grief counseling, but then the other one is not doing anything. And I really recommend that both people be doing their own counseling. And then sometimes they also need some couples therapy to help each other understand more of how the other one is dealing with the grief, because everyone deals with grief in their own way. And sometimes there's the expectation that the spouse should be grieving in the same way, and that's not always the case.
Right, because everybody's different. But yeah, I can see how that would happen. So really, you know, when you're going through the loss of a child in general, it is a very intense grief. It's a very intense pain. And being a mother who is going through Mother's Day without your child, Dr. Julia Becker said that the first year can be the hardest. Just give your friends and loved ones support. Offer specific things to do. Maybe, hey, can I bring over a casserole tonight? Do you need me to go grocery shopping for you? How are you doing on milk and bread? I'm going to bring you some. Is that okay? You know, things like that, because it's the details that they're really not going to want to deal with. And, you know, one of the things that Dr. Becker mentioned is that, you know, sometimes they forget to eat. Sometimes, you know, just sleeping is difficult. What can you do as a friend or a family member to help them to get through those moments? It's not helping them to get through their grief overall, but helping them to specifically get through each moment, because the grief can last, like she said, sometimes 20 years. And we do want to say Happy Mother's Day to every mother out there, whether you have your child with you or you don't. Because just because you lost your child or your child is not with you does not mean you're not a mother anymore. You will always be a mother. You will always be loved as a mother. And you will always be, in our hearts, treated just like mom. So we want to say a very special Happy Mother's Day to our listeners out there. And if you have a story that you would like to tell us about your situation. Maybe you lost a child, or maybe you have a friend that lost a child. You can contact us on our page at www.thingsinmyheadblog.com, and note that we are changing our URL to www.thingsinmyhead.net. We're dropping the blog and adding a net. So if you would like to contact us at any time, you most certainly can do that on our page. You can always listen to us on Stitcher, iTunes, Spreaker Radio, or iHeart affiliate, as well as other podcast aggregates. Just search Things in My Head, and we'll be right there. You can contact us on Facebook and Twitter using the hashtag Things in My Head. We'll find you. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Becker, for your time and this wonderful insight into Mother's Day.
Yes, thank you, Angel, for having me. It was my pleasure.
We really appreciate it. And just know that you can contact Dr. Becker as well if you are someone who needs grief counseling or family counseling. And she also does student counseling. She's worked with Baylor University as well. Dr. Becker, how do we get in touch with you? If someone was in the Waco area and they wanted to get in touch with you for counseling, how would they do that?
Yes, they can call me at 716-9525 or visit my website, www.psybecker.com. And I will be happy to talk with anybody who has any questions about counseling. And if I'm not the right fit for them, I can refer them to a therapist who can work with them.
And I just want to mention here, too, that Dr. Becker does have a blog that it's called the Casual Therapist. And I've read a couple of articles on there, and they're very short and very to the point, and just some kind of free therapy there for you. But you can go to her blog at beckerpsychology.blogspot.com. And I really encourage you to check it out because she's got some really interesting articles there. If you're going through the loss of a child or grieving of a pet, even, she's got some articles up there for you to read and maybe get some pointers and tips. So that's it for today. We thank you for joining us, and we want you to join us next week. We're going to be talking about all of the changes that are going on at Things in My Head, as well as our new show that is coming up on Stitcher Radio at the end of this month, the Coupon Podcast. You've heard us talk about it with Coupon Coach Lisa. She's going to be joining me in the studio, and we're going to give you all the tips and all of the things that you need to know how to extreme coupon in the real world. We're going to be talking about all of that next week right here on Things in My Head. Bye for now.